everyone. Welcome to the Poison Pen. This is such an exciting day for us. We have two stellar events today at noon with Ruth Ware and A.J. Finn, and then at 2 o'clock, Ann Perry will join us. So this is our first visit with Ruth, the author of this being her sixth book. And I wanted to say the commercial moment before we progress on. This lovely book comes with, I'll show you, a autographed book plate, because Ruth is in the UK, so unfortunately books don't swim and we couldn't work that out. But even more fun, look at this fabulous beanie with a one by one, I love it, one by one logo on it. And even if Phoenix is not the ideal place to wear a knitted cap, some of you watching this will live in colder climates. And as Ruth said, you could actually just wear this to the mall where the air conditioning is blasting and feel comfortable, right? So, Ruth, we have some of your other books here on display, but one by one, you have varied your settings, which I really like. We've been to Scotland, we've been to Cornwall, and now, and I have to say it's been wonderful this summer to read you in Switzerland, where everybody, we're all
traveling.
No, it's just the temperature is fabulous. And AJ, we haven't seen you for over a couple of years, but we were lucky enough that you joined us when The Woman in the Window published. So it's lovely to have you back. And I'm going to sit back and turn this over to you to interrogate Ruth as you wish.
So welcome, I'm AJ Finn. I'm going to be interviewing the indomitable Ruth Ware. Just a bit of background on me and Ruth. I used to work as a publisher and editor before becoming a novelist, and amongst the estates I published was that of Agatha Christie, whose work has delighted me since I was a kid. When I first heard of Ruth Ware 6 books ago, it was in the Agatha Christie context. People in New York publishing were really excited about this debut that was pitched as Agatha Christie, but darker and more psychological. And I scoffed because I'm a bit of a purist, and I didn't want anyone hijacking Christie's strengths, which included ingenious plotting and surprise endings. Ruth Ware's In a Dark, Dark Wood blew my tiny little mind. What she does is, I guess on the surface, comparable to what Christie does. I don't think Christie is the best comp in a lot of ways. Ruth is sort of like P.D. James meets Gillian Flynn with a dusting of Agatha Christie on top, and with every single book, she has managed to outdo herself. As I told Ruth in an email last night when I was sober, I was so sober. I was, truly. It wasn't yet 5 p.m. So she manages to toy with the conventions of the locked room mystery whilst infusing and suffusing each book with real psychological depth. These books are scary, but they're also really fun. And I've met Ruth twice in person before, most recently, I think in Lyon, in France, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, in France. Yeah, very appropriate for the setting of this book.
Absolutely. So would you mind telling us about this book, please?
I would love to. And can I just say what an amazing introduction? I think we could probably just leave the event there.
Let's go. We're done.
I'm not going to top that. So bye, everyone. Yeah, so One by One is my 6th book. I cannot believe that I've written 6 psychological thrillers. And it's another locked room mystery, which regular readers will know I do like a good locked room mystery. And it's my first time that I've done 2 narrators. So One by One is set in a luxurious ski chalet in the French Alps. And the chalet has been hired for a corporate retreat by this tech company, Snoop. And my 2 narrators are Erin, who's the chalet hostess, so she's in charge of, making everybody comfortable, making sure the wheels keep turning, and Liz, who is the former PA for Snoop. Now, you quickly find out that the reason Snoop have decided to come on this corporate retreat is a little bit of R&R, but mostly they have this huge question about their future to thresh out, which is that they've been offered this make or break buyout offer, which is going to make some of them millionaires, but others of them are bitterly opposed and want to retain control of the company and take it public eventually. Now, the reason Liz has been invited is because she was at the company way back in the beginning. And so she has this tiny 2% shareholding, which because of the way the votes have fallen out, means that she has the casting vote in this buyout. So they're all locked in this chalet. Liz is under huge pressure from all sides and feeling pretty miserable, and they go out for a day of skiing that's supposed to kind of, you know, relax everybody. But a blizzard descends and one of the founders goes missing in the snow. Just as they are trying to figure out whether this is maybe an accident, maybe not, an avalanche descends and a few more bodies start to appear. So none of that is spoilers, by the way. You know the number of bodies at the beginning, so don't worry, I haven't given too much away.
I want to note, too, that in a way, trying to pitch one of your novels sort of does them a disservice, because after certain sentences, you want to say, dun, 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 you know, there's an avalanche, or someone doesn't come back. But in the books, it's much more subtly done. Before we get into that, though, could you describe Snoop for us, please?
I had such fun creating Snoop.
I could tell. I could tell.
It was genuinely, I think this was it was probably the book that I found most just pure fun to write. And so I knew I wanted to write a book about a corporate retreat and to look at, you know, professional working relationships and all the kind of stresses and strains that arise from that. And I knew that I wanted to set it in a ski resort because I haven't done that before, and I wanted to, I love skiing, I wanted an excuse to write about the mountains and so on. So I had to decide what kind of a company would have the resources to hire a really exclusive ski chalet. And I thought, well, you know, maybe hedge funds, maybe an investment company, but I wasn't super interested in finance. And then I thought, a .com startup, you know, they've got money to burn, surely they would go to the French Alps. So I decided it would be an app startup, at which point I had to invent an app, which turned out to be surprisingly hard. Like, I have a lot more respect for app developers now. So I took like a week over this, and I came up with a bunch of ideas, and I kept thinking, what a great idea for an app, and then I would Google and, oh, surprise, it would already be an app. And eventually I came up with this idea, which is a music app that you hook up to your Spotify or your Apple Music or whatever it may be. And it makes your listening public. So anybody who knows your username can log in. And if you are listening to anything, no matter what it is, at any point, they can hear beat for beat what you are listening to in that moment in time. But the quid pro quo is that you get to snoop on other people's listening. So everybody's on there, you know, following Beyonce or, you know, Jay-Z or whoever their kind of musical heroes is, to find out, you know, what they're really listening to. And the kind of the USP is that idea of, you know, when you're first going out with someone and you put like one earbud in your ear and one earbud in their ear and you're listening, and it's that kind of intimacy of listening to the same song at the same time. And my idea was that Snoop gives you that, but via the internet with complete strangers. So I love it. So I want it to be an app. So if anybody's watching who knows any app developers, please develop it. But yeah, I had a lot of fun with the company and coming up with, you know, their kind of corporate style. So
when you talked just now about that very specific moment when early in a relationship you're both listening to one earbud, it occurred to me that these days, well, I've now got wireless earbuds, so it wouldn't be quite so romantic.
You could just wander off with your earbud, couldn't they? You'd be like, excuse me, that's my...
Get back here. One of the aspects of Snoop that I like so much, aside from the name, which is perfect, and the concept, which seems to me really both compelling and plausible, is that it tapped into this curious dynamic in 2020 and in recent years, but especially this year, where we want to share everything. It's not merely that we want access to others' information or preferences. Many of us, particularly of a certain age, want them to have access to ours. It's something that as a quite private person I don't understand, but through Snoop, I kind of got it. I would like to hear what certain people are listening to, and if it means that, you know, Blondie can listen to what I'm listening to, I'm listening to Blondie, so they'll be fine.
You'll be
Who
fine.
would you listen to?
No, it is really interesting to me, and it's something that I looked at a little bit in The Turn of the Key, which was also about that kind of Faustian bargain that we make with technology when we you know, the exchange that we make when we invite something into our lives because it makes our life more convenient or more fun, or it enables us to find out stuff about other people. But, you know, as they always say, if you're not paying for something with money, you're paying for it in a different way. And very often with free apps and free, you know, software, what you're giving up is your privacy. And we're still figuring all of that out. And, you know, we love that when we Google our local pub, Google knows that it's our local pub and not, you know, the Queen's Head in Edinburgh, which is 500 miles away. And it knows that because it has tabs on us all of the time, and it knows that we've been to this place 6 times, and it's got all of that in its algorithm. And that part we love. But other stuff, you know, we find deeply creepy when we go into a store and then 2 minutes later it's flashing up special offers saying, you know, please come back and spend 10%. So we're still, as a society, kind of figuring out how we feel about that. And Snoop is, like its tag in the book, is voyeurism for your ears. So it's offering people that kind of that safe version of intimacy that in a way Instagram offers, you know, when you feel like you're getting a very intimate insight into someone's life, but actually it's only a really small portion of who they are. It's quite a safe portion. But of course, Snoop themselves are gathering information on their users all the time, which becomes an important plot point that I won't spoil. And they're not sure how their users feel about that, and their users aren't sure how they feel about it. So yeah, I think because it's still one of the great shifting unknowns in society at the moment, it's really interesting as a novelist to kind of look at those pressure points where society's still kind of figuring stuff out.
Your publisher kindly supplied me with a list of questions, and I've also prepared my own. This one's from the publisher. I thought it was really good. In your novels, you have frequently staged the action someplace inviting, like a cruise ship, for example, or in this case, a ski chalet. Why? I mean, I think it's great. It's very appealing. I want to go to these places.
I think that's ultimately it. I mean, the kind of standard answer is that, you know, you set your novel somewhere that you would like to go on holiday so that you can offset your next holiday on tax. But actually, the truth is, I've never done that. You know, I set the Woman in Cabin 10 on a cruise ship, and I've still never been on a cruise, principally because my husband finds the whole idea of a cruise revolting. So I still feel slightly cheated that, you know, I wrote this whole book and didn't even get one cruise holiday out of it. And likewise, although I love to ski, and it's probably no surprise to anyone who knows the resort well, but Saint-Antoine is sort of very loosely based on Val d'Isère, like it's got a sort of similar vibe to it. And I love Val d'Isère. I've skied there many times. It's one of my favourite places. There's a ski run at the end of the book, which is loosely based on a real ski run in Val d'Isère, which terrified the... In fact, the book is dedicated to 3 friends who took me down this run slightly unsuspectingly and got me to the other end in one piece, so I thank them for that. But I didn't go skiing in between writing the book and coming up with the idea, so again it was all kind of drawing on experience. So I think the truth of it is that I have to set, like, it takes a year to write a book, more in some cases.
Or more. Yeah.
It's perfectly fine to take longer, AJ, I would just like to say that. And I have to want to spend time in this place for, you know, I mean, The Woman in Window is set in a completely enviable New York brownstone, and I'm guessing that's because that is a place where I can spend a year or two. You know, I have to want to spend a year in this place and in my imagination, and I hope that that comes across to readers as, you know, a fun place to spend a few days of their own.
One of the adjectives I do find myself consistently applying to your work is fun. And so much crime fiction, past sometimes, but especially present, is quite moody. It's like a dirge. Do you have to make a conscious effort to keep things not light, but enjoyable?
Well, that's a really good question. And it's funny because the more you do these events, the more you do get asked the same questions over and over again. And this is genuinely one that I've never had. I think I try to ring the changes a lot in my books. So some of my books are much darker than others, like The Lying Game and The Death of Mrs. Westaway are both pretty sad books. They're books about loss and grief and overcoming the baggage that you carry with you from your past. And all of my books are about that to some degree, but some of them are more light-hearted than others. And I think One by One is quite a fun book. It's quite a funny book, although it gets darker as it goes on. But I do enjoy putting jokes in. I'm naturally quite a sort of sarcastic. I don't want to say I'm naturally a funny person, because that's like, I'm like, oh, you'll find me hilarious. But I try to be funny. Like, I enjoy telling jokes, and I don't think I take life too seriously. And that does come across in some of my books. But I know my editor's watching this. I think she is, so I'm going to be careful what I say. But my editors quite often tell me to tone the jokes down, because they're not supposed to be funny books. Not so much now, but certainly my first editor for In a Dark, Dark Wood, went through it and took out a lot of the jokes. She was like, Ruth, stop trying to be funny.
Looking back, before we return to One by One, I would like to talk about your career, which in the States, as elsewhere, has built steadily, I mean, actually quite sharply in sales from a very successful debut on upwards. I think it was your second book that hit #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and you've gone up ever since. In terms of your, and this sounds really obnoxious, but in terms of your like artistic progression, which book do you think represented for you the most significant leap forward?
Ooh, this is another very good question. I mean, probably, so I wrote YA before writing crime, so I would say, just in terms of the biggest leap of confidence, it was writing In a Dark, Dark Wood, because I'd been writing for teenagers, and writing for adults felt like a big change. Writing crime felt like a big change. It felt like being a debut all over again, and it was in many ways. I was kind of terrified launching that book. And then writing The Woman in Cabin 10, that was the book that I enjoyed writing the least, because paradoxically, In a Dark, Dark Wood did so much better than I had ever expected it would. You know, I thought I was writing this weird little British book about a hen party, you know, who on earth knows what that is outside of the UK, and I just didn't expect that many people would read it. And this book was doing better and better, and it was, you know, getting on lists, and it was getting picked up and selling in different territories, and the film rights were optioned, and all of this made me feel infinitely worse about the difficult second novel that I was writing. And I threw everything into that book because I was just so desperate to show that I wasn't a one-trick pony, and that I could write another book that was interesting and compelling and page-turning. But I think, you know, you always, I don't know, I don't think I can put my finger on one book that was a bigger leap than any other, but I am quite proud of having tackled 2 narrators for the first time in One by One. I've always been very jealous and very admiring of other writers who can pull off multiple narrators and multiple points of view. And so many of them seem to do it just, you know, just like walking. It's like no big deal. And I hate reading books where I'm reading a first-person narrator and I can't tell who it is. You know, when there's multiple narrators and you're having to flick back and think, hang on a minute, whose chapter is this? Which is why I'd never done it, because I wasn't sure that I could pull off that very distinct voice. So I feel proud of myself for having gotten over that fear and forced myself to face my own inadequacies.
I thought you did it remarkably. I have the exact same reservations about both reading and writing stories with multiple narrators. My second book, which I'm finishing, features 3, and man, is it difficult. Two is difficult to delineate between them, to give them their own senses of dimension and humor. I thought it was, it was so good, Ruth, what you did, not what I'm doing, that I did go back through the first 5 to see if you've done this before. If you haven't, as you know, I'm not informing you of anything of which you're unaware. So, well done. So this brings us to One by One. You do have these 2 narrators. Could you please describe them for us?
So my first narrator, Erin, she's the kind of the hostess of the chalet, and she's in this kind of weird position because she's staff and therefore an outsider, but she's also kind of in charge in a weird sort of way. So although she's there to do Snoop's bidding and kind of make sure they're comfortable and get them drinks and fix stuff, at the same time, when things start to break down, she's the person who kind of takes on the mantle of authority and decides what's going to happen and when. And she does it very consciously, even though she's one of the youngest people there, because she's very much aware that if she doesn't take this upon herself, someone else in the group is going to do it, and they might not be a good person to be in charge. They might not be someone who has other people's well-being at heart. Erin she's quite a cheerful person. She has a really great relationship with her co-worker Danny, who is the chef at the chalet, and that was one of the things that I really wanted to explore in the book. Having done books about toxic friendship, you know, difficult families, dysfunctional relationships, I realised that the one relationship that I never really tackled was the one that we have with our colleagues, which is hugely influential for many people. You know, we spend, not at the moment, but in general, we spend more time in their company than with our families in many cases. And I wanted to show what happens when a company allows really kind of toxic practices to build up. And for that reason, I wanted to showcase a really good kind of collegiate colleague relationship, and that is Erin and Danny, who, you know, they're supportive, they're friends, they have each other's backs, they won't let each other down. The other narrator is Liz, who is a completely different personality type, and she's the former secretary of Snoop. She left Snoop under very difficult circumstances, which she doesn't talk about. She's come back only very reluctantly because she has to vote in this buyout offer. And all of my characters have a little bit of me in them. The confident ones, the kind of, you know, the baddies, the good people, all of them have a seed of me. And what Liz has of me is my kind of social anxiety. And, you know, you probably know this, AJ, having worked in publishing, but as a young person in publishing, you spend quite a lot of time pretending to be more confident than you really are in a room full of people who are infinitely better dressed and better groomed and better paid than you. And, you know, all those years of walking into rooms and sort of thinking, I'm not dressed right, my hair isn't blow dried, I'm not made up properly, you know, all of that kind of sense of inadequacy I poured into Liz, poor girl. So she's been working at this kind of incredibly moneyed, slick firm full of people who are, you know, privately educated, very groomed, very entitled people. And she just doesn't fit in there, and she feels it constantly and constantly, you know, doubts herself. So she's quite a tough person to be in the head of. And initially, when I was telling the book, I told it from the point of view of Erin. And I got to about 30,000 words, and I thought something's not working. And I sent the book to my agent, and I said, I'm not sure about this. I'm not quite sure if it's working. And of course, what I wanted her to say was, it's wonderful, stop doubting yourself, keep going. But because she's a really good agent, she said, no, you're right, it's not working, and you need to figure out why. So I've never done this before. I've never had a full start with a novel. And I went back and I was just kind of tearing my hair. And I realised the issue was that Erin was a complete outsider to the situation, which was why I picked her, because I wanted to have a kind of disinterested perspective on Snoop and on all the kind of toxic stuff that's going on in this company. But the problem was she just didn't know enough about the inner workings of the company. So she was spending an awful lot of time overhearing conversations and trying to figure dynamics out. And I thought, I need to have a narrator who is embedded in Snoop and understands what has gone on there and knows these people through and through. And Liz seemed like the perfect counterpoint to that, because she's also an outsider, but in a completely different way to the way Erin is. So yeah, you get one chapter from Erin's point of view and one chapter from Liz's point of view as it goes on. And the most fun thing for me about the book was playing off their perspectives against each other. So very often, especially towards the end, you see the same events unfolding first from one point of view and then from the other. And often they're radically different, and one of them has information that the other one doesn't. And it was just fun saying to the reader, this is happening, and then showing it from a different perspective and saying, but actually what's really happening is this. And it was, yeah, I loved it. I'm only going to write dual narrators from now on. No, that's not true. I'm never going to do it again.
So effectively, it seems that you realized or decided that the story just could not really be told by one person, probably by any one person. Was Liz already in place? Did she exist as a character then?
Yeah, she totally existed as a character, and she was pretty... Obviously, all characters develop as you write them because you get to know them better.
Yeah.
But she, yeah, like her backstory was in place. I knew who she was. But yeah, it just had never occurred to me to tell the story from her perspective. And actually having two narrators just, yeah, it gave the story what it needed.
Don't you feel proud of yourself? I'm well done. Seriously, that is a big leap.
I'm sure she
Well, it was...
I'm sorry, go
Sorry?
ahead, and then we do have some questions, so when you're done, let's take a few questions and then go back, okay?
Oh, Ruth, whenever you're ready.
Well, I am proud of myself, but I'm also very aware that this is something that lots of other writers do apparently effortlessly. So, but I think we're allowed to say it's hard, aren't we, AJ? I feel like...
Yes.
Absolutely true. So, Pat, do we have a question or two?
We do. We have one question about whether or not they have any sort of input whatsoever about either their cover or for who selects reading their books on audio.
All right, these questions come up often. Do you have any input on your cover design? And I will note that your British cover is slightly different than your American cover, which I always find the perception of how the British publisher wants to present a book versus the American to be fascinating. And then also, do you have any input on your audio readers? So, Ruth, do you want to take that one, and then AJ could answer too?
Yeah, I would love to. I always enjoy hearing about other authors' experiences, so you can go back and say to your publisher, well, AJ's publisher lets him know. I don't really have any input into my covers at the beginning. So what normally happens is my publishers go away and they sometimes ask me for sort of themes and things, but normally they go away for X number of weeks or sometimes months, sift through loads of options which I don't get to see in case I fall in love with the wrong one, and then they come back to me with a final version and they say, I hope you love it. And usually I do love it. Sometimes I have kind of specific tweaks, so like for The Death of Mrs. Westaway, the initial cover that was shown to me had like a woman in a full skirt walking across a lawn, and I said, I think this makes it look like a historical novel because she was wearing like a raincoat and it looked like she was wearing a kind of, 19th century dress. And the publishers agreed and changed it to a figure wearing jeans, so it was more obvious that it was contemporary. But the one-by-one cover, I just loved. I was shown the American cover and I was like, yes, that is it. That's my cover. I love it. And interestingly, and they worked it out completely separately. One by One is the first book that I've had where the US and UK covers have been similar. Normally they have radically different treatments, and this time I was like, like the colours are slightly different, but the general kind of layout and feel of the cover is very similar. And to answer the audiobook question, Imogen Church did my first audiobook, and she was picked by the publisher, and I was just sent a clip to say, do you like it? And I did. I think she's an absolutely fantastic reader. And since then I've been lucky enough to have her for every single book, so she's kind of become the voice of Ruth Ware and does it so much better than I ever would, because I can't do accents. So when I do my readings, I have to be sure to pick the section quite carefully so I don't have to do any regional accents, whereas Imogen does them amazingly. But now I want to hear what AJ's answer is, because I'm intrigued.
Before I answer, Ruth, did Imogen do both narrators then in One by One?
Yeah, she did. Yeah.
Good for her. It's like she's an actress. I worked in publishing for 10 years, almost exactly, and over that decade sent lots of emails to authors saying, here's your jacket, we love it, we hope you do too, which is usually code for, this is the jacket, like it, but just expressed prettily. And one of the veins of my job was arguing with authors beyond a certain point about their jacket or their title. I did want an author to express any reservations she or he might have had. I wanted to hear them out, but past a certain point, you do feel like saying, from time to time, I do know what I'm doing. I'm not telling you what to write. You please don't tell me what to publish. So I was all set to be an almighty pain in the ass when I became a novelist. But as it turned out, I loved the very first jacket that my American publisher showed me. I loved it. That was the one I wanted. And one major retailer didn't like it, but we pushed back and it sold perfectly well. I do remember in the UK fighting with my publisher about the jacket for the woman in the window, until I remembered what I just said to you, namely, authors are often perceived as difficult, and I did not want that. Again, they
were like, I'm being that author.
Absolutely. Right. And the other point I would make, too, is that you gotta draw the line somewhere. I am published in 40-something territories. I don't know anything about those markets. I'm just gonna, same with you, Ruth, right? I just want to let them do what they do. As for the audiobook, I selected an actress after my publisher sent me a few options. I met her in Los Angeles. Her name is Anne-Marie Lee. She was lovely. I thought she did a bang-up job, and that was that.
Great. Another question?
I really like this question. What is your writing kryptonite?
What is your writing kryptonite? I'll bet that's not a question, Ruth, you've previously encountered.
I don't think I have ever been answered it, but I can tell you in 2 words: social media. I love talking to readers. I love interacting with people on, Facebook and Twitter. But I spend way too much time on Facebook, particularly kind of, gossiping with other writers and kind of swapping news and just, it's so tempting. It's so tempting, when the writing's going a bit badly and you just can't quite think what's going to happen in the next scene, or you're not quite sure how to get your characters from A to B. You think, I'll just check whether I've got any notifications on Twitter, and then 2 hours later you're doom scrolling through the latest COVID statistics and arguing with someone about, politics, or all the myriad rabbit holes that we spend our lives going down. So yeah, that is my kryptonite. What's yours, AJ?
I will say, in the past, I've never taken much to social media. I stopped tweeting years ago. Set up Facebook, never understood it. I do post to Instagram once in a blue moon, but I know from past experience that I would always justify my wanderings into social media. I'll say it is necessary as an author that I find out what so-and-so thinks about, Cool Runnings or whatever. My social crypto, I can actually show you. You might have heard her because she's starting. This is truly my kryptonite.
Oh.
Got her 2 years ago, and I if she walks by my office, I decide she's in need of attention. As you can see, she doesn't.
I think that's fair enough. She's adorable.
Tommy, thank you.
That's not being a bad writer. That's being a good dog owner. So.
Distractions around the house, but I think I might be less distracting than social media, to be honest. Good luck with that.
I could just turn off my notifications, so it's entirely self-inflicted, whereas you can't turn off your puppies.
Or can I? No, you're right.
Another question.
Was there another question?
Yeah.
Somebody wants to know about what's the most difficult thing about writing characters of the opposite sex.
What is the most difficult thing about writing characters of the opposite sex, presumably to you?
To AJ, because I've never done a narrator of the opposite sex. I've done characters, obviously, who are male, but I've never tried to get inside the head of a bloke. It's not that I would never do it. I do think about it, but I think what I know about is what it is like to be a young woman, or not so young now, a woman in the 21st century, and I haven't finished saying what I have to say about that. So until I've run out of inspiration on that score, I don't know if I would. But maybe my next book will have 3 narrators, and perhaps one of them will be a bloke. But I want to hear AJ's answer, because he did it so brilliantly in The Woman in the Window.
Just once. And this might sound quite cavalier, I did not find it particularly difficult. And at the risk of sounding holistic, I thought, well, I'm a man, she's a woman. Presumably we share, if not anatomy, then a lot of neuroses. Most of her formative or definitive experiences were those that I myself had experienced in some way at some point. So I don't want to decide that our experiences are just effectively similar, because they're not. I will say, one of the reasons I think women write better suspense novels, better novels, period, really, but better suspense novels, and why female characters generally make for more fully realized protagonists, is that women, real and fictional, have to deal day in, day out with threats or uncertainties or discomforts that I never experience. I was thinking about this recently when walking down the pretty barren streets of Manhattan with the dog. I'm a 6'3", 200-pound white man. No one's going to mess with me. Ruth is not a 6'3", 200-pound white man. Not by a long shot, actually.
Not yet, though.
Work on it. And I don't know that if I were, a woman, I would feel, I'm sure I wouldn't feel as secure as I do. Women seem much more alive to and attuned to the experiences of menace and risk and danger. And that's why I think their books are better.
Keep the flattery coming down, we love it.
But it's true.
There was
another question. Yeah.
Yes. So one of our readers would like to know if they, when they're writing their books, do they have it in mind to make it more of a book club type of book when they're writing? One that's better for a discussion group.
Oh, that's an interesting question. When you're writing, do you have any impulse to think about it as better for a book discussion group than a single reading experience? Book clubs have become so ubiquitous, I can see why that is actually a question that one would ask. We have 4 of them here at the store, or we did have 4, now down to 3. And they're all different. And it's interesting how they choose which one, to belong to, and the books that they want to choose. So is that ever in your mind when you're writing?
You want to go first, AJ? I feel like I've answered all the other questions first. So.
I can just say no, which I don't mean to sound flat, but it didn't for the first one, or for the second. But it's a really interesting question, but no from me.
It's a no from me as well, to the extent that the only way I ever managed to write a book is by pretending to myself that no one's going to read it apart from me. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have the confidence to write a word. And I was in discussion with another writer the other day, and they called it the selfish draft, which I love, like it's the draft for you kind of thing. And I don't know if I would call my first draft selfish exactly, but it's self-indulgent. It's a draft that I write pretending that no one's going to read it, and I can afford to be as cheesy or as crass or as, poorly described or as, whatever it is. And it's only when I come to edit my first draft that I allow myself to, think about what my editor might think, and to imagine my mother-in-law reading the sex scene and all those kind of, that's the point at which I allow the imaginary reader to look over my shoulder and think, I wonder what they would think about this scene. And that's when I get self-conscious. And the whole editorial process for me is about getting closer and closer to the realization that this book is going to go out there into the world and be seen by other people. And I think that's why, in a way, In a Dark, Dark Wood was my easiest book to write, because I wrote it completely without expectation. I wasn't under contract. I didn't know if it would be published. It was just kind of purely to please myself. And every book since then has been written in the knowledge that it will be published and it will be read by other people. And I have to kind of fool myself back into that happy place of imagining that I don't have anybody to prove anything to, or, you know, to say anything to apart from myself. But to bring it back to the book club, I do think that crime novels and psychological thrillers naturally tend to make quite good book club books, because we're dealing with, I mean, first of all, there's just the whole kind of, you know, did you guess who it was? Did you spot the clues? Did you see the thing on, you know, did the twist work? Which is just fun to discuss with other people. I don't think I've ever finished a book that had a really amazing twist where I didn't think, I want to go back and talk to someone about that. I want to know if they spotted it. But also we, as a genre, we tend to be dealing with the big questions of what it's like to be human, and politics and society and inequality and, you know, poverty. And I don't think I've ever written a book where I didn't grapple to some extent with, you know, questions about class and money and inequality and, you know, sexual power games and, you know, what it's like to be disadvantaged and who wins out in situations. And all of those make for good discussion points, because not everybody's going to have the same, you know, point of view as I do. And sometimes a book that everybody disagrees with makes the best book club book. So
I agree. I could add a footnote, having done this for so many years, that everybody reads a book differently. And I sometimes think that the questions that publishers put into books, you know, for discussion, in a way are almost act to homogenize reactions that probably are even more different. But, you know, if people come and and that's in front of the group, I often wonder if it tailors people's responses and reactions, you know, kind of, it's not like a group shaming, but maybe a group. It's my objection to the Indie Next list. I really don't like the Indie Next list because I think it homogenizes books that bookstores want to offer their customers. I think it's kind of a lazy book selling thing, so we don't do it. We have never participated in the Indie Next program because I just don't care for it.
I do think the most interesting book club questions are often the ones that ask the reader what they bring to the experience, because everybody's read the book. You don't need to tell the readers what's in the book because they've just gone through it. They're more equipped to tell you about it than the question is. But what's interesting, I think, as someone who's participated in a lot of book clubs, is when people explain why they reacted to a book the way they did. And often the questions that draw that out and ask people about their own experiences are the ones that make for the best discussion, because you learn something new about your friends, which is always fun.
That's a very good point. A last question over here, or is there more than one?
I think there's one for both AJ and for Ruth, okay. And it's the fact that, well, there's a comment that Ruth Ware's books are all very different. So they want to know how she comes up with a unique idea for each book. And I think AJ is probably in the same category.
Same category. So the comment is that each of your books is so different, not being as series driven and exploring different things. It's the old "where does your idea come from" question, but you know, slightly different. How do you move from one to another and come up with a new idea that will, you know, keep readers thinking it's a Ruth Ware book, but it's not going to be the same as the last book?
Do you want to go first, AJ, or shall I?
Only written one book, so
I thought it was more a Ruth question. Sorry, we don't know yet what your second book will be.
Well, I'll talk a bit, and then maybe AJ can, with his perspective on the book that he's currently writing. So it is very difficult, and actually AJ and I were talking about this earlier, the fact that as a standalone writer you have to reinvent the wheel each time, and sometimes that feels insurmountably difficult. And I really do envy series writers who have, you know, a recurring cast of characters and a recurring setting, because, you know, I'm sure that writing series has its own issues in terms of, you know, keeping it fresh and not saying the same thing each time, and, you know, how do you keep upping the ante with your character when you've already put them through the ringer. But there are every time I start a new book, I sit down and I think, oh my goodness, how can I create another world from scratch, another narrative voice, another cast of characters, another setting. And every time it feels insurmountably difficult, and every time so far, touch wood, I've managed to do it. But I think I'm not going to say I'm an easily bored person, because if I was, I would never finish a book. But I'm certainly someone who I like to challenge myself, and I want to do something different with every book. And I think so far I have, in ways that maybe aren't always apparent to the reader, but with each book I've tried to set myself a new challenge, do something differently, do something that I haven't tried before, the dual narrators in One by One being a case in point. So I try to keep things fresh for myself that way, and hopefully that comes across to the reader. But I would love to find a series protagonist. It's just that I'm not very interested in police officers. I mean, I love, as people, they're fine, but I don't want to write one. So, yeah. So, AJ, what's your view on this? Are you going to write a series next?
If I can ask you a quick question, have you thought about whether there's like a Ruth Ware universe? Do you think all these books take place in the same dimension, or are they just completely, like, might the characters ever run across one another?
Yes, definitely. They take place in the same world, and I could imagine, like, kind of the way Donna Tartt does, where she has a character turn up in. But I haven't done it so far because partly because I write locked room mysteries, not all the time, but frequently, and that by nature kind of precludes someone just turning up as a bit part character and saying, oh, what whole what chaps, I'm so and so forth. But I do occasionally reuse names, and sometimes readers spot that, like surnames or something, and say, oh, is so and so related to, it's not always deliberate, sometimes it is.
I always thought that if I did a series, and I have absolutely no plans to, but I would do something along the lines of what Tana French does with her first, I think, 5 or 6 books, which were all set within the Dublin Murder Squad, but each book featured a different character as the narrator. So you got a fresh perspective on a world that was already built. I quite liked that. And sorry, I was going to answer a question. What was the question? Sorry, that Ruth just answered very cogently. About
how do you do something different each time, and do you feel your books are very different?
Thank you, Ruth. The tables have turned. My second book, which is nearly finished, is another psychological thriller. It features, as I mentioned, multiple narrators, and whereas my first book took place almost entirely in that's described in an enviably luxurious Harlem brownstone, this one takes place in an enviably luxurious San Francisco mansion, but the characters do set foot outside quite frequently. So I'm sticking with what I feel comfortable with, expanding the number of narrators, but I'm not yet ready to do. I mean, just to bring it back to Ruth.
You're not writing a cruise ship novel yet.
No, I'm not ready for that cruise ship. For me, it was The Death of Mrs. Westaway. The Lion Game struck me as unexpectedly dark, and I thought that was quite bold and satisfying. But The Death of Mrs. Westaway was a different kind of book, or would you disagree?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, my first 2 novels were Christie inspired. The first one slightly unintentionally. I didn't have it in mind when I was writing it, but when the reviews started coming in, I was like, yeah, fair point. I can see what I have taken from her, and it's there. And so when I was writing The Woman in Cabin 10, those comparisons were uppermost in my mind, and I suppose I wanted to sort of say thank you to Christie for all the inspiration and fun and reading enjoyment that she'd given me over the years by writing a book that was not a homage exactly, but definitely a nod to her and the pleasures that I got from her books. The Lion Game is sort of, I guess it has some Christie-ish elements, but yes, The Death of Mrs. Westaway is my thank you to Daphne Du Maurier, who is, I think, a stone-cold psychological thriller writer. I love her work. In my view, she's mistakenly classified as just generic lipfic. I would argue for her being a crime writer until the bitter end. and her characterization is just second to none. And in many ways, she invented the psychological thriller and the unreliable narrator, or at least, you know, perfected it, I think. And I guess I just wanted to, you know, to do a tip of my hat to what she had done. And then The Turn of the Key is, again, entirely different. That's a thank you to Henry James, and The Turn of the Screw. Not intentionally, but I got halfway through and realised I was like, okay, I think I'm writing The Turn of the Screw, which I'd never read. So at that point I thought, I better go back and read it, because if I'm going to do this, I should do it intentionally rather than sort of just blundering around. And it's amazing, and you should all definitely read it. Yeah, so I guess that was a long answer, but
It's a good one.
No, it's the next
and one
answer.
probably comes back to Christie again. It's my most Christie-ish book since Cabin 10.
Do you know, one of the most interesting things about publishing right at the moment, you've probably both noticed it, is there's this huge resurgence of Christie. I cannot think of how many books over the last 3 months and books coming, all of which are acknowledged to be in debt to Christie. Most often, and then there were none, but various other, and in myriad authors and in myriad sorts of settings and whatever. But I find it fascinating that, and I wonder to some degree, because her big, you know, the 1930s was really her, you know, the late 20s and the 30s when she was, and I wonder if, because we're back in the 1930s, if that has something to do with it. You know, and maybe in part, when there's so much uncertainty going on, we're looking for, because Christie did bring certainty. She, you know, she had all the surprises and the twists and all the rest of it, but there was real certainty in most Agatha Christie books. You know, you came to a definite conclusion, and the structure was definite, you know, despite her. And I'm wondering if that's part of what we are seeing right now, is a kind of unconscious grabbing hold of that in a very tumultuous era. Just a thought.
I think that's definitely true. You know, she does, however bad things get in Christie, she's very kind of brisk about it, and sort of, you know, oh dearie, there's a body in the library, well, never mind, we'll go and sort it out, you know. And there's always a sense of kind of restorative justice at the end, even if someone doesn't necessarily go to the gallows. There's usually, you know who did it, you know they're not going to get away with it on some level. And she can't make everything right because people are dead, but there's a sense that everything's going to be okay and it's going to carry on. And I think it's no coincidence that, you know, she was one of the most read authors, but also one of the most prolific authors during World War II. And she wrote 12 novels during World War II, from 38 to 44, which is an insane production for any author, let alone when, you know, there was paper rationing and the publishers were really having to pick and choose which novels they produced because they just didn't have the paper to publish everybody. And I think it's very much serving as reassurance and kind of, yeah, that sort of sense that everything's going to be okay in the end. But the other reason why I think we're seeing it now is because Christie was super unpopular for a big kind of chunk of the sort of 60s and 70s. You know, she was seen as very cozy, and the 80s to an extent. And then in the sort of late 80s, 90s, she became quite fashionable again. And we had, in the UK at least, we had David Suchet as a brilliant Poirot who was on TV every night. I grew up with him. We had Joan Hickson, who is still my Miss Marple. Everybody has their own Miss Marple, who again was enormously popular. The BBC did lots of adaptations with her. And so for many of us, she was kind of, you know, she was a regular feature of our childhood and adolescence in a way that became a very kind of cozy part of our upbringing. And so I think, as you know, that generation of writers have grown up, it's no wonder we're kind of harking back to her influence.
I think you're right, but I also think the fact is, you know, in all of her books there would be a rent in the social fabric, and then somehow she would knit it all back up, regardless of whether everyone had the same punishment or no punishment. But she always did restore order. And I think, you know, her own experience when her life went so disordered may have, in fact, inspired her, you know, to do that. Let me see, is there a last question, or are you just standing by?
I'm just
You're
standing by.
standing by. So AJ, I cut you off because we had so many questions. What would you still like to ask Ruth that we didn't get to?
Oh, quite a lot, actually. But first, I'd like to know that Ruth just selfishly said everything I wanted to say, only better. I would note that, and I agree with her fully on this point, when Ruth and I were growing up, because we're of the same generation, we were not distracted by devices or, TV hours for me were strictly limited, as they were for most kids, I think. And there was not distraction at our fingertips. So, that ties into a larger discussion about literacy in young people. But I read Agatha Christie ceaselessly because she's actually pretty easy to read. If you're 10 or older, you can read her. And so I have, like Ruth, grown up with this affection for her. Secondly, I would add that I was thinking recently about how Gone Girl, published in 2012, shook the world, seismic bang, and how there have been many successful books, psychological thrillers since then. Ruth has authored most of them, but they usually end, if not happily, then at least acceptably. And I'm thinking about how Gone Girl was published in 2012, which I recall as a time when everything was pretty good. Obama had fixed the American economy. He was cruising to re-election, which he won. We were in a mood to get a little disturbed or disrupted. I do not want disruption right now. I want to read a book with in which order is restored. So I think that's the key to Christie's resurgence. Ruth, I did have two final points to make. One, in your books, we've noted how you will set the scene in some place often quite luxurious or at least lavishly interesting. You also assemble these casts of characters who, in One by One, for example, represent there are actually two hierarchies. There's the staff, but there's also Snoop. And in A Dark, Dark Wood, you've got the hen party celebrants. And then some event, murder, disrupts that hierarchy, and it seems to be the great equalizer. Do you, as an English woman, feel that this is a concern or an observation specific to your accursed race? Or because the English are, I say this having lived there for 10 years, quite class conscious. And it is interesting to see British characters in a novel by a British author level the playing field.
Yeah, grappling with that. I think it is something that we're more conscious of in the UK, but I would say that I think the reason why I'm so obsessed with it as a topic, because it's something that recurs in lots of my books, is because I think globally it is one of the biggest issues that we're facing is the level of inequality, financial inequality in the world. And that goes for America just as much as the UK. We have a class system in the UK, but there's also a class system in France, there's also a class system in America. We are building a world in which the 1% or even the 0.1% can do pretty much whatever they want. They can have the education they want, they can have the healthcare they want, they can have the lifestyle they want. And they are becoming richer and richer and richer, and the rest of the world is getting left behind. And I think the last time we saw fiscal levels of inequality this high was the 1930s. And we all know what followed that. And I think that when people are involved in a game in which they keep rolling the dice and they keep losing and the same person keeps winning, they no longer want to participate in that game. And the sensible thing to do becomes not to keep rolling the dice, but to kick over the table. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in politics, well, not unfortunately, because, it's not a situation that's sustainable long term, but I think a lot of the political upheaval we've seen has been people kicking over the table. They're saying this isn't a system we want to participate in anymore because we no longer see any benefit to ourselves. And that's something that as a global society, we don't seem ready to grapple with. But it's something that worries me, and so it's something I guess that keeps cropping up in my novels. But I don't think anyone can live in London as I used to, and probably in New York as well, without being aware of the enormous gulfs that exist, even in the same street. You know, you can have a family living in a multi-million-pound house where they've got 2 or 3 rooms each, and a garden, and a conservatory, and a couple of cars out the front. And then immediately backing onto it, you can have the exact same house that's been divided into 14 flats, each housing a family. How can you live in that situation looking across at your neighbours and not feel resentful of the hand that life's dealt you when you're working longer hours and harder and making ends meet? So yeah, that was a long answer, but
the final question I'd like to ask, because I know we've got to wrap up, among the many pleasures of your books, I find, is that while there is always a very satisfying final twist, you needn't rely on the twist as a reader or as a writer, I imagine, to appreciate the rest of the book. I from experience, get quite annoyed when I hear readers say about, well, my book, but about books I've edited or like, that, oh, I saw the twist coming, so I didn't like it, or I didn't see the twist coming, ergo it was a successful book, which to me seems very reductive. Some books are written solely for the delivery of a final twist, so like a Jack in the Box. How do you feel about expectations for some sort of aha moment at the end?
well, see, I don't think that I write books with a twist. The way I see books with a twist as being like Gone Girl or I Let You Go, or, you know, a book where the narrative you think you're reading is not the narrative that is really happening, and there's a moment in the middle where it's kind of like everything twists, and it's like one of those seeing eye pictures, you know, where everything shifts into a different focus and you realize that what you were looking at is not what you thought you were looking at. And I don't typically write those books.
I see that, yeah.
There's a few moments where there's a big reveal, and that reveal might radically change your opinion of what has already been happening. But I think what I give people is unexpected reveals more than twists. But I do agree, it's frustrating when every book is expected to be, you know, have a Gone Girl style kind of 360 in the middle. And often when I read reviews of books, not necessarily mine, but other people's books, where people say they guessed the twist, often it wasn't something that was supposed to be concealed, you know, it's something that was there, I thought was meant to be. I do think the reason why people read books is really compelling characters that you want to find out what happens to them, and you can tell when a book has been constructed solely to make the twist work, and when the characters are not behaving plausibly, because if they did, it would dissolve the twist. And as a reader, I find that frustrating, and as a writer, I hope I don't do it very often. So.
Oh no, I wouldn't say so at all.
I'm going to add a footnote to that, because actually before 2012, there are 2 wonderful examples. We backed Agatha Christie in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. We all know about it, so it doesn't have the impact right now that it did when people read it. But, excuse me, when I launched Scott Turow's book last May, I pointed out to him that Presumed Innocent was really a brilliant example of this. And I remember people standing at the checkout counter at the bookstore arguing about who did it or how it got done, because the forensics were not, we weren't so sophisticated then. So I really think of Scott as a pioneer way before Gillian in that kind of a book. And it's worth rereading, to see how he did it. This has been so delightful. Thank you both very much for joining us. Let me just say goodbye to our Facebook audience and then hang on a moment. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. I'll remind you again that we have copies of One by One with a nifty hat and a signed book plate, and we have The Woman in the Window, and at some point we will have a new book by A.J. Flynn.